The collector's edition of Splinter Cell Conviction comes with an art book and a message. The Sam Fisher you knew is dead. It's a sentence that has a few meanings. Narratively, regardless of your preferred double agent, Sam was last left in a weird spot. His daughter had been killed, and his discordant relationship with Third Echelon and the military-industrial complex had finally come to a head. He was a wrongfully accused criminal on the run, his world having crumbled around him, and a lot of questions were left unanswered. What would happen to Third Echelon? What did Williams have against Fisher and Lambert? Was Williams the mole? Like many video game franchises before and since, Conviction had a bit of a mess to clean up, and it would either need to ignore story beats or contour itself to fit the shape left by Double Agent, all the while building a new way forward. Montreal's Double Agent may not have improved upon Chaos Theory, but the formula was at least still there. Open-ended missions with various ways to handle obstacles. The levels in Chaos Theory and Double Agent are designed almost closer to an immersive sim, and even as 7th gen consoles rolled around, that structure was not so old or antiquated as to be left behind. Conviction, however, does leave much of that foundation behind, and Sam, now untethered by the delicacies of international law, is a man out for revenge. These two elements providing the dual meaning behind the Sam Fisher you knew is dead. Splinter Cell has never been known for its story, but I think early series entries have deeper stories than they get credit for, even if you have to dig through Sam's OPSAT to find them. And say what you will about older Splinter Cells, but the series had a really strong identity. They were stealth games, sometimes rigid, other times flexible, and sometimes with flourishes of excitement, but they were always about stealth. With Conviction, we get mostly misguided spectacle, the priority set on set pieces and shaky cam dramatics, mimicking the aesthetics of TV and movies without understanding them. Hallmarks of superficial AAA splendor. Granting that figuring out where to go from Double Agent is difficult, with Sam an apparent fugitive and Lambert dead, Conviction displays a misunderstanding of the characters that came before it and the themes the previous games carried with them, as well as an unwillingness to fix or rewrite weak narrative elements from previous games. This starts from the very beginning, during Kost's opening monologue.
A drunk driver killed him, some anonymous asshole who ran down his daughter and vanished. She was the one thing in his life that humanized him.
I really dislike that line. Not only is it a little clumsy, especially coming right out of the gate, but it's also not true. Sam is not a weapon devoid of any humanity. He has a personality, he has a sense of humor, and he has friends. The banter between Sam, Grimm, Lambert, and Redding is part of what makes Chaos Theory so good, and it's also partly why both double agents feel so empty. Later on, when Sam infiltrates Third Echelon HQ, Kost says this.
It shows you how much Sam changed that he would even think about going after Third Echelon. He'd been a company man, loyal to the bone. But now, here he was, ready to rip the guts out of the beast.
Again, this ignores the friction between Sam and his job, his spats with Lambert, and some of the more interesting character moments from previous games. Despite Conviction's tone and its clear desire to be a story about a man pushed to his limits, what it ends up being is a melodramatic noir spy thriller, unable to handle its own baggage, let alone the baggage of games that came before it. Conviction is so caught up showing us an angry and tumultuous Sam that his other relationships get little substance outside bursts of rage and bitterness. One of Conviction's biggest struggles is figuring out how to handle Sarah, a character that, in Conviction's defense, Splinter Cell generally has never known what to do with. Sarah is Sam's key motivation, she is his emotional core, and even with her minimal screen time, there is effort to give her a real personality. When she and Sam get separated, it's Sarah that insists Sam do the right thing and help Grimm. Of course, right afterward, she's politely escorted off stage, never to be seen again. Similarly, Lambert's death isn't re-examined through any more complex lens than generic rage. Considering how often we are reminded that Lambert and Sam were best friends, this is frustrating. For Conviction, Sam's relationships are used mostly as poor excuses for violence and anger. Any deeper reconciliation, growth, or any real character development apparently couldn't fit on the storyboard. I guess there just wasn't enough room? Double Agent may not have left Conviction with a smooth starting point, but many of Conviction's creative decisions are of its own design, unbound by whatever poor writing happened before. Grimm returns as Sam's quasi-handler, a character to bounce dialogue off of, but by solidifying Lambert's death and disappearing Redding, Conviction creates a void. Who would Sam talk with? Where would he get the support necessary to help save Sarah and the president? Enter Victor Coste, Splinter Cell's own Sam Drake, just without any of the narrative purpose. Though, strangely enough, he also sounds and looks like Sully. The issue is not necessarily that Redding or even Lambert and Grimm were indispensable characters, but more so that they already existed and were developed. Coste is an unnecessary character plugging a self-created gap in Conviction's narrative. Like Douglas Shetland before him, Coste is another former Navy SEAL who also owns a private military company. In an already awkward space for a new character, Coste is given an awkward background. PMCs have not been the good guys in Splinter Cell. Arguably, there are no good guys in Splinter Cell, but Sam's cynicism came from the awareness of his place in the military-industrial complex. So to pair Sam with a character that explicitly comes from that space seems to grind against the narratives of previous games, but it does give you an easy way to excuse how Sam gets handheld EMPs or why Coste has an attack helicopter. And when considering Conviction's actual priorities, I suppose it's a creative decision that makes sense. While divisive even today as a new style of gameplay, Sam's agility and faster movement mirrors Conviction's themes of anger and revenge. He's on a personal mission and no longer worried about international law or geopolitical instability. Like Shanghai's double agent, stealth is binary. Sam is either exposed or invisible, denoted by the screen turning black and white. A simplification that, again, works thematically and works fine within the rest of Conviction's structure. The incentive to stay sneaky is still here. Open firefights aren't a great option. Sam can carry assault rifles and shotguns, but they tend to be inaccurate, and enemies can eat a few hits before they go down. One of the first things that hooked me to Splinter Cell when I was younger was the tension of stealth. The tension of being a few feet away from a guard and hoping he didn't catch on. Conviction's emphasis, though, has gone from carefully and stealthily sneaking past or eliminating enemies to guerrilla combat. Sam's smaller assortment of gadgets, his sonar goggles, and his new mark and execute ability are all based around this style, and the penalty for being spotted is minimal. In fact, being spotted is almost a strategy itself, as you can use Sam's last known location ghost to set traps and reposition for ambushes. Conviction's level design appropriately leans into Sam's new movement. There are plenty of different avenues for Sam to hide, escape, reposition, and re-engage, from pipes to windows. Credit where credit is due, Conviction's flashiness can be fun. Taking your time studying a group of bad guys, marking them, and executing at the exact perfect moment can be exciting. And without serious consequences for breaking stealth, you're given much more room to experiment and to improvise. But because Sam is faster and more agile, and because the consequences for breaking stealth aren't as severe, he is also less vulnerable. Suddenly, a group of enemies closing in on your position isn't anywhere near the problem it was in previous games. Conviction is not just a faster pace than older Splinter Cells, it's a reorientation of an entire philosophy of gameplay, and one that makes for gameplay that is, tactically speaking, much shallower. When you consider everything previous Splinter Cells put in your path, like turrets, lasers, spotlights, mines, and cameras, as well as all the different strategies and gadgets you'd use to get past those things, Conviction's level design feels empty and plain. Many of Conviction's levels are just variations on the same scenario, and Sam's smaller selection of gadgets narrows your options for dealing with obstacles and groups of enemies. There aren't very many problems a remote mine or mark and execute won't solve. Part of the problem is how long Conviction's single player takes before its gameplay is fully employed. Sam doesn't get his goggles until about halfway into the third echelon level, which means you're not utilizing the full breadth of Conviction's new mechanics until the final third of its single player. In the meantime, sizable chunks of the single player are dedicated to boring and unnecessary set pieces, many removing you entirely from Conviction's standard gameplay. Coste's Gulf War flashback is a half-hour slog of bare-boned third-person combat, the fact that it's set on the highway of death only adding to the groans. The level shows us why Sam trusts Coste, an understandable thing to do considering he's a new character, but the combat and level itself are not fun or challenging, it's barely generic. Sam's trip to the Lincoln Memorial is a particularly bizarre level that seems to exist because someone wanted a cool chase scene but didn't know where to put it. Sam has to spy on Reed and Galliard and record them plotting their conspiracy, but rather than sneaking past guards and placing a sticky cam somewhere, he just jogged to a camera room and control a security camera for a few minutes. After torturing Galliard, Sam chases an assassin through tents and backstage equipment, not exactly the type of stuff made for eye-catching art direction. The assassin eventually dies and Sam is cornered in a coffee shop, an unmemorable ending to an unmemorable piece of Splinter Cell history. If you hop over to Deniable Ops, one of Conviction's alternate game modes, you'll notice that the levels are more fully and consistently designed to accommodate gameplay. They're playgrounds, with more varied terrain and more complex architecture. Hunter mode specifically feels closer to a traditional Splinter Cell experience by calling for enemy reinforcements if you're spotted. And not only will enemies threaten you with being overwhelmed, but enemy reinforcements approach from opposite directions, pulling you away from your position and forcing you to backtrack. A few levels even have choke points enemies will sit at and wait, which makes for interesting gameplay. This happens in Conviction's single player too, but not as often. Levels in single player don't always have the same multi-tier design that the levels in Deniable Ops consistently have, which makes them less interesting. Without serious penalties for breaking stealth, gameplay in Conviction's single player feels brief, easy, and lacks the slow-burning tension Splinter Cell always excelled at. But even beyond the level design, Conviction's problem will always be foundational, gameplay that is flashier than it is deep. Whether it be with remote mines, mark and execute, or having infinite ammo with your pistol, entire sections of gameplay can easily be reduced into quick 20-second bursts of combat, minimizing the environment around you and making levels feel smaller than they actually are. As I replayed Conviction, it occurred to me that I missed the endgame rating screen previous Splinter Cells gave you at the end of missions. This was something I never personally cared about. I loved playing as stealthily as possible, but I've never been a person concerned with ratings and high scores, really across gaming in general. That is, I thought I really didn't care about those screens until I felt their absence in Conviction. Maybe it's just basic psychology, but it's nice to have your work shown back to you, and I think for a lot of people, chasing those higher scores is where the fun was, to find further creative ways around obstacles and push just how elusive Sam could be. As exciting as Conviction can be, its level design, fast combat, and largely consequence-free stealth just isn't as deep, intricate, or thoughtful as previous games. Sam was never an action hero. He was never Jack Bauer or John Wick. He was slow, middle-aged, sarcastic, and most importantly, vulnerable. Vulnerability is a foundational element of stealth. It comes in many forms, and undoubtedly over the years, games have innovated on and re-examined what being a stealth game means. So to say extreme vulnerability is essential to all stealth would be an oversimplification. But for Splinter Cells before Conviction, it was Sam's vulnerability that made it so exhilarating. Any random guard with a gun could kill Sam in an instant, and his success came down to your wits, patience, and awareness. The opening to Shanghai's Double Agent has a blunt reminder of this, when Sam watches a younger Splinter Cell get ignobly gunned down. Conviction isn't a straight third-person shooter, stealth is still a part of its gameplay, but it lacks the weight of serious vulnerability, whether that be vulnerability to enemy weapons or vulnerability to the consequences of breaking stealth. Without that threat there, Conviction comes off more as an action game, and as an action game, it's fine, but as a Splinter Cell game, it makes me want to play Chaos Theory. There is a certain ugliness to Conviction that previous Splinter Cells, fully acknowledging their problematic themes and spotty writing, never had. Sam's thoughts and objectives projected onto his surroundings is an interesting idea. We almost literally see a character's ambient thoughts, the raw, unfiltered emotion of a ground-down soldier. But human emotions are often more complex than the words that describe them. So when hope and anger flash on a wall, they undercut scenes where Michael Ironside's already iconic performance does an effective job conveying those emotions. Those scenes are just bad, but others, like Conviction's torture scenes, are more than bad. They're cruel and mean-spirited. I think it's relevant to bring up here that Maxime Balan, director for both Conviction and Blacklist, resigned from Ubisoft in 2020 following a wave of workplace misconduct allegations. One infamous story involved Balan choking a female coworker at a work party. It's impossible not to think about this, specifically during Sam's reunion with Grimm, which I would consider among the worst scenes in the entire franchise. It begins with some eye-rolling boob physics and a brief but complex explanation detailing Reed's actions and setting him up as Conviction's main antagonist. As Grimm is working undercover, she tells Sam to hit her in order to make it look like Sam escaped. As leverage, Grimm says she knows where Sarah is but won't say anything unless Sam hits her. Sam eventually relents, but he doesn't just hit Grimm. He grabs her by the back of the head to do it, and while Grimm is on the ground saying the wound should be enough, Sam interrupts her with another hit. one that is unnecessary and done out of anger. Sam's second hit here is to inflict pain. As a scene that's meant to drive the plot, it's clunky. Reed's coup is established, as is his partnership with Black Arrow, and Sarah's subplot is pushed forward all within a few seconds. It's hastily delivered exposition meant to bridge the gap between what Conviction is even about and Sam hitting Grim, which is the thing the scene actually cares about. Conviction is a game that heavily bears the mark of early and mid-2000s American politics, perhaps more than any Splinter Cell before it, and we see this most explicitly in its depiction of torture. When Conviction released in 2010, in the US, the use of torture as a means to extract information had been debated for almost a decade, and Conviction appears at least slightly aware of the history of that debate. When Sam beats Galliard, Galliard says,
"Your enhanced interrogation techniques need work."
Enhanced interrogation was a euphemism for torture specifically used by the CIA during the War on Terror. The ostensible justification for Sam's use of torture throughout Conviction is that time is of the essence. Sam has no other option but to torture his enemies in order to extract information and stop them. It's for the greater good. This is what's known as a ticking time bomb scenario, a moral dilemma that asks us whether or not torture is permissible when there is no other option but to use it in order to stop imminent danger. This hypothetical situation was used in arguments justifying torture in the years following 9/11. In fiction, sometimes this scenario is employed as a tacit or explicit approval of real-world torture. Other times it may simply be there to make things provocative and shocking, as is the case, I believe, with Conviction. In reality, torture has never been an effective technique for extracting information. Not that Conviction is actually interested in crafting a thoughtful commentary on any of that. No, Conviction's depiction of torture, as well as Sam hitting Grim, is purely theatrical. There is no attempt at inspecting what it means for Sam as a character or person, nor how it relates to Conviction's wider narrative. Each torture scene happens in a small area with multiple objects Sam can slam his interrogee into. Occasionally, a small flourish is added. Coben swings an American flag at Sam. This random Black Arrow guard attacks Sam with a knife. Sam kicks Galliard in the crotch. None of this is fun, engaging, interesting, or necessary. Sam is a violent person. I don't think there's any doubt to that. But as I've argued in previous videos, Sam is not malicious. In Conviction, Sam is definitely in a space where his character could undergo a change. He's been labeled a criminal and for a time believes his daughter was murdered. That framework makes sense for a story about a fall, a person pushed to the edge and succumbing to the worst aspects of their personality. But that process also requires a well-written story, which Conviction is not, and it also means these scenes of excessive violence, of unbridled anger and rage, need consequences. They need to mean something. Sam's anger, his bitterness over being lied to, makes sense, but Conviction is a one-dimensional revenge tale with very little to say about anything. I don't know if it's ever been explained why Williams was replaced with Reed between Double Agent and Conviction. I mean, there are justifications, but I suspect the real reason is that the character was either neglected or rewritten during the churn of game development. Conviction did go through multiple delays, and at one point was even restarted. All that, though, is moot, because we really never knew why Williams was doing what he was doing, and for Reed's motivation, it falls in line with previous Splinter Cell villains as one that's vague and half-written. We learn that behind Reed is a shadowy group called Megiddo, but they only exist in name and are dropped from the series almost entirely after Conviction. It isn't until the very end when we get somewhat of an explanation for Reed's actions. The president had planned on defunding Third Echelon, and Reed, arguing that it's in the best interest of national security, planned his military overthrow. There is a seed of an interesting idea here, and Conviction, likely unintentionally, leans into it. When Sam infiltrates Third Echelon HQ, the building is spacious and imposing, the massive eagle's talon ominously looming over the entryway. Where in previous games other Splinter Cells are known to exist, in Conviction, Sam encounters dozens of Splinter Cells and even more Third Echelon agents, all working to overthrow the government. Where Third Echelon began as a small intelligence operation, it had now ballooned into a much larger military force able to wield power far beyond its original scope. In an alternate Conviction with a far more detailed and intricately written story, a Third Echelon corrupted by its relatively autonomous power would not only make sense, but pair nicely with previous Splinter Cells, where villains fought back against American imperialism and military overreach. Instead, we can file Reed away as another antagonist who represents more of an idea for a motivation than an actual motivation. During their final confrontation, you're given a choice. Sam can either execute Reed or walk away. Ultimately, the choice is meaningless. If Sam walks away, Grim kills Reed afterwards, so he dies either way. But for Sam, if he kills Reed, it's just a revenge killing. If he walks away, it feels awkward considering Sam has spent the better part of the last few days torturing people to get to him. There is no moral high ground to be salvaged here. Whatever your choice, the ending has nothing to say about Sam, his methods, how he uses violence, or anything else. Along with backloading Reed's exposition, it feels like the entire point of Conviction's ending is the spectacle of executing the bad guy on the Resolute desk in the Oval Office. Conviction has many of the same problems other Splinter Cells have. It's certainly not the only one with problematic themes or an underwritten villain. But Conviction's issues are magnified and made worse by its prioritization and over-reliance on action and cheap thrills. It feels like Ubisoft's attempt to make a Naughty Dog-style adventure, just without any of the charisma, storytelling, or adventure. And knowing the foundation Chaos Theory established, it's difficult not to wonder how Splinter Cell would have evolved if it stuck with what made it. I've heard that Conviction was ahead of its time. In some ways, this may be true. During the late 2000s and early 2010s, Ubisoft definitely popularized many of the open-world action-adventure tropes we see in AAA games today, like tagging enemies and visibility indicators. So I wouldn't necessarily disagree, and I'd even suggest that Conviction's combination of stealth action and parkour remains somewhat unique. But that sudden change wasn't brought about by a natural evolution or done because the structure and gameplay of older Splinter Cells had aged beyond viability. It was a new approach to stealth action, but one that wasn't and isn't nearly as satisfying or thoughtful. The obvious irony of this sentence is that Sam Fisher, in some ways, really did die in Conviction, at least as we've known him. It's Michael Ironside's final full game playing Sam, ending what I would consider to be one of the most iconic and well-performed characters in video game history. Splinter Cell would go on without him, a series with a new identity, and now a new voice.